What happens when the hunted becomes the hunter, when desperation transforms into deadly strategy? Today, I'll tell you the incredible story of a man who turned the tables on his oppressors in the most brutal way imaginable. This is a tale that will challenge everything you think you know about survival, justice, and the lengths a human being will go to claim their freedom. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon. You won't want to miss stories like this. The year was 1847, deep in the heart of Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains. The morning mist clung to the ancient oaks like ghostly fingers, and somewhere in those shadows, a legend was about to be born. But legends aren't born overnight. They're forged in the fires of suffering, shaped by years of careful observation, and tempered by a will that refuses to break. His name was James, though the plantation records listed him simply as Property Jus 47. 28 years old, with scars mapping every failed escape attempt across his back, and eyes that burned with an intelligence his masters had tried desperately to break. But James possessed something they couldn't chain. A mind sharper than any blade, and a knowledge of human nature that ran deeper than any textbook. The Davenport plantation sprawled across 4,000 acres of Virginia soil, its wealth built on the backs of over 300 enslaved souls. Master Jonathan Davenport was known throughout 3 counties as a particularly cruel owner, a man who believed that fear was the only language his property understood. He was wrong about many things, but he was absolutely right about one. James was planning something. "That boy's got the devil in his eyes," Davenport often told his overseer, Marcus Crenshaw. "He reads people like books, and I don't like what he's learning. Watch him close. He's planning something big." Davenport was right to be worried. James had been planning for over 2 years, but not just an escape. He was planning a revolution of one. He had studied every white man on the plantation, learning their habits, their fears, their weaknesses. He knew which overseers drank too much, which guards fell asleep on duty, which dogs responded to which commands. More importantly, he had learned to read the psychology of power, how men who had never been truly challenged would react when their authority was questioned. James had been born on the plantation, the son of a woman who died in childbirth and a father he never knew. Raised by his grandmother, old Sarah, he had learned early that survival meant more than just staying alive. It meant staying invisible while your mind grew strong. "Listen more than you speak," old Sarah had whispered to him as a child. "Watch more than you act. The white folks think we're simple because they need us to be simple, but simple minds don't survive, child. Remember that." She had died when James was 15, but not before teaching him something that would prove invaluable: how to read the land. Old Sarah had been born free in the mountains of North Carolina before being captured and sold south. She knew every plant, every animal track, every weather sign. She taught James that the wilderness wasn't something to fear, it was something to understand. "The forest don't care about the color of your skin," she had told him. "It only cares if you're smart enough to listen to what it's telling you." For 13 years after her death, James had listened. He learned which berries were safe to eat and which would kill you. He discovered how to move silently through underbrush, how to mask his scent from tracking dogs, how to read the sky for weather changes days in advance. But most importantly, he learned patience. The other enslaved people on the plantation saw James as quiet, obedient, unremarkable. The overseers saw him as a reliable worker who never caused trouble. Master Davenport saw him as proof that some slaves could be properly broken. They were all wrong. James was a student, and the plantation was his university. Every day he gathered intelligence. He memorized patrol routes and shift changes. He noted which guards were alert and which were lazy. He studied the psychology of the hunting dogs, learning their individual personalities and weaknesses. He even befriended some of the poor white farmers who lived nearby, men who saw him as harmless and spoke freely around him about local geography and politics. But James's education went deeper than mere observation. He had taught himself to read by studying discarded newspapers and listening to conversations in the big house. He understood the political tensions of the time, the growing divide between North and South, the economic forces that drove the slave system. He knew that his individual escape was just one small part of a much larger struggle, and he planned accordingly. During his years of preparation, James had also developed a network of contacts among the enslaved population of neighboring plantations. Through carefully orchestrated meetings at church gatherings and market days, he had learned about escape routes, safe houses, and the Underground Railroad. But more importantly, he had learned about the men who hunted runaways, their methods, their weaknesses, their psychological profiles. James discovered that most slave catchers were motivated by greed rather than ideology. They were often poor whites who saw hunting human beings as an easy way to make money. They relied on intimidation and superior numbers rather than skill or intelligence. Most had never faced truly organized resistance, and they certainly had never been hunted themselves. This knowledge shaped James's ultimate plan. He wouldn't just escape. He would turn the entire system of slave catching against itself. He would become a predator so effective, so terrifying, that the very thought of hunting him would give men nightmares. The opportunity for escape had presented itself dozens of times over the years, but James had always held back. He knew that a simple escape would only result in recapture or death. What he was planning was something far more ambitious and far more dangerous. He was planning to become a nightmare. James had also spent years studying the local terrain with the dedication of a military cartographer. He knew every cave, every hidden spring, every game trail that wound through the mountains. He had identified natural defensive positions and escape routes that would be invisible to anyone unfamiliar with the land. More importantly, he had begun to cache supplies in strategic locations throughout the mountains. Food that wouldn't spoil, tools that could be used as weapons, even crude maps drawn on pieces of bark and hidden in waterproof containers. The psychological preparation was perhaps even more important than the physical. James had spent countless hours visualizing different scenarios, planning his responses to various types of pursuit. He had studied the behavior of hunted animals, learning how they evaded predators, and applied those lessons to his own situation. He had even practiced moving silently through the forest at night, conditioning his body to navigate by touch and sound when visibility was limited. The final catalyst came on a sweltering August day in 1847. James was working in the tobacco fields when he witnessed something that crystallized years of careful planning into immediate action. A new slave, a young woman named Mary, who had been purchased just weeks earlier, had collapsed from heat exhaustion. Instead of providing water or shade, Overseer Crenshaw began beating her with his whip, screaming that she was faking weakness to avoid work. James watched as the other enslaved people looked away, knowing that intervention would only result in their own punishment. He watched as Crenshaw's whip opened bloody wounds on Mary's back, and he watched as something inside himself finally snapped. That night, as the plantation slept, James made his final preparations. He had cached supplies in hidden locations throughout the mountains, food, tools, weapons he had carefully crafted and concealed. He had studied maps stolen from the plantation house, memorizing every trail, every river, every settlement for hundreds of miles in every direction. But most importantly, he had prepared psychologically. James knew that what he was about to do would transform him from victim to predator, from property to force of nature. There would be no going back, no return to the relative safety of slavery. He would either die free or become something that would haunt the nightmares of every slave owner in Virginia. The opportunity came on a moonless October night. A violent thunderstorm had rolled through the valley, masking sounds and washing away scents. While the other enslaved people huddled in their quarters, James slipped into the darkness like smoke. He moved through the forest with the silence of a predator, his bare feet finding purchase on wet leaves and slippery rocks. Behind him, the plantation grew smaller until it was nothing but a distant glow. Ahead lay hundreds of miles of wilderness, and beyond that, maybe, just maybe, freedom. But James had made one crucial miscalculation. He had underestimated just how far Jonathan Davenport would go to make an example of him. By dawn, when Overseer Crenshaw discovered the empty quarters, Davenport was already assembling the largest manhunt the county had ever seen. 30 armed men, 2 packs of bloodhounds, and a bounty that made every poor white farmer in 5 counties reach for their rifles. $1,000, Davenport announced to the gathered crowd outside the county courthouse. $1,000 for the return of my property, dead or alive. And an additional $500 for anyone who brings me proof that he suffered before he died. It was more money than most of these men would see in 10 years. The hunt was on, but the hunters had no idea what they were really chasing. The first week was a masterclass in psychological warfare, though the hunters didn't realize they were being taught. James moved through the mountains like a ghost, but he wasn't simply running, he was studying his pursuers. From hidden vantage points, he watched the hunting parties, learning their tactics, their personalities, their weaknesses. He noted which men were natural leaders and which were followers. He observed who was brave and who was simply along for the money. Most importantly, he identified who would break first when the tables turned. The bloodhounds were relentless, their baying echoing through the valleys like the voices of demons. But James had prepared for this too. He had spent months conditioning himself to the scent of certain plants that would mask his trail. He knew which streams would wash away his scent and which would carry it further. He had even learned to mimic the movement patterns of local wildlife, confusing the dogs about what they were actually tracking. During those first days of pursuit, James employed tactics that would have impressed military strategists. He created false trails that led hunting parties in circles for hours. He used the terrain to his advantage, leading groups of hunters into box canyons and swampland where their horses became liabilities rather than assets. He even managed to turn the hunting dogs against each other by using scents and sounds that triggered their territorial instincts. But perhaps most importantly, James began to study the psychological dynamics of the hunting parties. He noticed that the men were motivated by different things, some by money, others by the thrill of the chase, still others by a desire to prove their superiority over what they saw as an inferior race. Understanding these motivations would prove crucial in the psychological warfare to come. On the 4th day, exhausted and running on nothing but determination and carefully rationed supplies, James made a discovery that would change everything. Hidden in a rocky outcrop deep in the mountains, he found the remains of an old Cherokee camp, abandoned decades ago when the tribe was forced west on the Trail of Tears. But more importantly, he found something else, evidence that he wasn't the first to use this place as refuge. Carved into the stone were symbols and marks left by other runaways, a secret language of survival that had been passed down through generations of the desperate and the brave. Among those marks, James found detailed information about the hunters' patterns, their weaknesses, their fears. Previous fugitives had left behind a treasure trove of intelligence about how to survive in these mountains, and more importantly, how to turn the hunt against the hunters. The Cherokee camp also contained something else of immense value: weapons. Hidden in a carefully concealed cache were tomahawks, knives, and even an old musket with ammunition. The Cherokee who had lived here had been warriors, and they had prepared for the possibility of a last stand. Now their weapons would serve a new warrior in a different kind of war. James spent 2 days at the camp, not just resting and resupplying, but learning. The Cherokee had left behind more than just weapons and warnings. They had left behind a philosophy of warfare that would transform James's approach to his situation. The Cherokee understood that when facing a superior force, victory came not through direct confrontation, but through patience, cunning, and the willingness to make the enemy's strengths into weaknesses. That's when James realized something that would transform him from prey into predator. He wasn't just being hunted by men, he was being hunted by men who had never truly been hunted themselves. They understood pursuit, but they had never experienced true fear. They knew how to track, but they had never been tracked. They were experts at intimidation, but they had never been intimidated. James decided to give them an education. Among the Cherokee artifacts, James also found something that would prove invaluable: detailed knowledge of the local weather patterns and seasonal changes. The Cherokee had lived in harmony with these mountains for generations, and their accumulated wisdom about survival in harsh conditions was encoded in symbols and drawings throughout the camp. James learned about hidden water sources that never froze, about caves that provided natural shelter from the worst storms, and about the migration patterns of game animals that could provide food when other sources failed. Perhaps most importantly, James discovered that the Cherokee had faced similar challenges when fighting against overwhelming odds. Their tactics of guerrilla warfare, hit-and-run attacks, and psychological intimidation had allowed them to resist much larger forces for years. James studied these tactics carefully, adapting them to his own situation and adding innovations based on his unique understanding of his pursuer's psychology. The first lesson began on the 7th day. Thomas Garrett was a local farmer who had joined the hunt more for the adventure than the money. He was a braggart who told anyone who would listen about his prowess as a tracker and his experience hunting dangerous game. He had never hunted anything more dangerous than a deer, but the other men in his hunting party didn't know that. Garrett was tracking what he thought was James's trail through a narrow ravine when the ground simply gave way beneath him. The pit was 15 feet deep, lined with sharpened stakes that James had spent hours preparing. But James hadn't designed the trap to kill quickly. He had designed it to teach. The pit was a work of engineering genius. James had studied the soil composition and drainage patterns to ensure that the trap would remain stable until triggered. He had calculated the depth and angle to maximize psychological impact while ensuring that his victim would survive long enough to understand what had happened. Most importantly, he had positioned the trap at a location where Garrett's screams would carry to his companions, maximizing the terror factor. Garrett's screams echoed through the mountains for hours before they finally stopped. But it wasn't just the screams that terrified the other hunters when they found the pit 2 days later. It was what James had left behind. Garrett's rifle was gone, along with his ammunition and supplies. His boots had been removed and placed neatly at the edge of the pit, as if he had simply decided to take a swim, and carved into a nearby tree was a simple message. Lesson 1. The hunted is now the hunter. Class is in session. But James had left more than just a message. He had also left evidence of his intelligence and planning that shook the hunters to their core. The pit showed signs of careful engineering, proper drainage to prevent collapse, strategic placement for maximum effect, even a small cache of supplies hidden nearby that suggested James had been planning this specific trap for weeks. Fear began to creep into the hunting party like a slow poison. These were men accustomed to terrorizing others, not being terrorized themselves. They had joined the hunt expecting an easy payday, Not a war of nerves against an opponent who seemed to know their every move before they made it. But the bounty was too large to ignore, and Davenport's rage was too dangerous to disappoint. The plantation owner had made it clear that any man who abandoned the hunt would be considered a coward and would never work in the county again. For poor farmers struggling to survive, that was a death sentence almost as certain as facing James in the wilderness. The hunt continued, but now the hunters moved in larger groups, their eyes constantly scanning the trees, their fingers never far from their triggers. They jumped at every sound, investigated every shadow, and slept in shifts with guards posted around their camps. James watched them from the shadows, learning their new habits, their growing fears, their increasing desperation. He had become something new, not just a runaway slave, but a force of nature, a reckoning 28 years in the making. The second lesson came 3 days later. William Hayes was a professional slave catcher from Georgia, brought in by Davenport when the local hunters proved inadequate. Hayes was different from the farmers and opportunists who made up most of the hunting party. He was experienced, cautious, and genuinely dangerous. He understood that his prey was intelligent and had adapted his tactics accordingly. But Hayes had one weakness: pride. He couldn't accept that a mere slave could outwit a professional like himself. That pride would be his downfall. Hayes had been tracking James's trail for 2 days when he found what appeared to be a hastily abandoned campsite. The fire was still warm, food was scattered around as if dropped in panic, and fresh footprints led away into the dense forest. It was exactly what an experienced tracker would expect to find when closing in on desperate prey. It was also exactly what James wanted him to find. Hayes followed the trail deeper into the forest, his confidence growing with each clear footprint, each broken branch, each sign of panicked flight. He was so focused on the obvious trail that he never noticed the almost invisible tripwire stretched across the path at ankle height. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. When Hayes's foot caught the wire, it released a carefully balanced log that swung down from the trees like a massive pendulum. The impact didn't kill him immediately. James had calculated the weight and trajectory to ensure that Hayes would live long enough to understand what had happened to him. As Hayes lay pinned beneath the log, his legs crushed and his rifle out of reach, James emerged from the shadows like death itself. But he didn't come to gloat or to finish his victim quickly. He came to teach. "You're William Hayes," James said, his voice calm and conversational. "From Savannah. You've been hunting my people for 15 years. You've caught 47 runaways and returned them to their masters. You've killed 12 who tried to resist." Hayes stared up at him in shock. How could a slave know so much about his career? "I know because I make it my business to know," James continued, as if reading his thoughts. "I know that you have a wife named Catherine and 2 daughters. I know that you live on Oglethorpe Street and that you owe money to 3 different creditors. I know that you're here because Davenport offered you $500 plus expenses to bring me back." The psychological impact was devastating. Hayes had spent his career treating enslaved people as animals, incapable of complex thought or planning. The idea that one of them had researched his personal life, had studied him as thoroughly as he studied them, shattered his understanding of the world. By the end of the second week, the nature of the hunt had fundamentally changed. What had begun as a simple manhunt for a runaway slave had evolved into something far more sinister, a psychological war between a man who had nothing left to lose and a group of men who were slowly realizing they had everything to lose. James had killed 3 hunters and wounded 2 others so badly they would never hunt again. But more importantly, he had shattered the confidence and morale of the entire hunting party. These men had signed up to chase a desperate fugitive through the woods. They hadn't signed up to be stalked by what seemed like a supernatural force that knew their every weakness and exploited their every fear. The remaining hunters began to fracture into smaller groups, each suspicious of the others, each convinced that they were being watched from the shadows. Some wanted to abandon the hunt entirely, but Davenport's threats kept them in the field. Others wanted to burn the entire forest to flush James out, but the local authorities wouldn't permit such destruction of valuable timberland. During this period, James's tactics evolved from simple survival to sophisticated psychological warfare. He began leaving personal items from the dead hunters in places where their former companions would find them. A pocket watch here, a distinctive button there, always arranged in ways that suggested deliberate placement rather than accidental loss. The message was clear. James knew who they were, where they had been, and what had happened to their friends. More disturbing still were the messages James began leaving carved into trees throughout the forest. These weren't random threats or boasts, but detailed psychological profiles of individual hunters. He would describe their fears, their weaknesses, their personal histories with an accuracy that suggested supernatural knowledge. In reality, it was simply the result of careful observation and intelligent deduction, but to men already on edge, it seemed like witchcraft. Marcus Crenshaw, Davenport's overseer, was the fourth to die, and his death was the most personal yet. Crenshaw was the man who had whipped James countless times, who had broken his spirit again and again, who had beaten Mary nearly to death for the crime of collapsing from exhaustion. He was also the man who knew James best, having supervised him for over a decade. If anyone could predict James's movements and tactics, it would be Crenshaw. That knowledge made him dangerous, but it also made him a target. James had been watching Crenshaw for days, studying his new habits and routines. The overseer had become paranoid and cautious, never traveling alone, always staying in the center of his group, constantly checking his surroundings. But paranoia, James had learned, could be just as much a weakness as overconfidence. The trap James set for Crenshaw was his most elaborate yet. It required patience, precise timing, and an understanding of human psychology that would have impressed a trained military strategist. First, James began leaving false trails and misleading signs designed to draw the hunting party toward a specific location, a narrow valley with steep sides and limited escape routes. He made the signs obvious enough that Crenshaw would spot them, but subtle enough that the overseer would think he was being clever in his detection. Next, James began a campaign of psychological harassment. He would appear briefly at the edge of the hunter's vision, just long enough to be seen, but not long enough to be shot. He would leave personal items from the dead hunters in places where Crenshaw would find them. He would make sounds in the night that kept the entire party awake and on edge. But perhaps most effectively, James began to exploit Crenshaw's knowledge of him. He deliberately left signs that suggested he was reverting to old patterns of behavior, making the same kinds of mistakes he had made during previous escape attempts. To Crenshaw, it looked like the pressure was finally getting to James, causing him to fall back on familiar but unsuccessful tactics. The cumulative effect was to drive Crenshaw toward desperation. The overseer became convinced that he could end the hunt by confronting James directly, man to man. It was exactly the mindset James had been cultivating. James also began to exploit the growing tensions within the hunting party itself. He would leave evidence that suggested some hunters were planning to abandon the search, or that others were considering claiming the bounty for themselves by eliminating their competition. These subtle manipulations turned the hunters against each other, making them suspicious and paranoid about their own allies. The psychological pressure was so intense that several hunters began to crack under the strain. They reported seeing James in places where he couldn't possibly be, hearing his voice in the wind, finding messages that existed only in their imagination. The line between reality and nightmare began to blur, and James exploited this confusion ruthlessly. The confrontation came on a foggy morning in the narrow valley James had chosen. Crenshaw, accompanied by 5 other hunters, was following what appeared to be a fresh trail when they found themselves in a natural amphitheater surrounded by steep, rocky walls. "I know you're here, boy!" Crenshaw shouted into the mist. "Come out and face me like a man! You think you're so smart, but you're still just a slave. You're still my property." The response came not from James's voice, but from the valley itself. A series of carefully placed charges, black powder stolen from the hunters' own supplies, brought down sections of the valley walls, blocking the exits and trapping the hunting party in a natural prison. As the dust settled and the echoes faded, James appeared on a ledge above them, silhouetted against the grey sky like an avenging angel. "You're right about one thing, Crenshaw," James called down. "I am still the boy you used to whip. I still remember every lash, every humiliation, every moment you made me feel less than human. But you're wrong about something else. I'm not your property anymore. I'm your judgment." What followed was not a battle, but an execution. James had spent days preparing the valley, turning it into a maze of traps and ambush points. He picked off the hunters one by one, using their own weapons against them, turning their training into their downfall. The valley had been transformed into a killing ground of remarkable sophistication. James had studied the acoustics to understand how sound would travel, allowing him to confuse and disorient his victims. He had prepared multiple firing positions, each with clear fields of fire and concealed escape routes. He had even rigged sections of the valley floor to collapse under weight, creating instant pit traps that could be triggered at will. But perhaps most impressively, James had prepared for every possible response from his victims. He had anticipated that they would try to climb the walls and had prepared rock slides to stop them. He had expected them to try to return fire and had positioned mirrors and reflective surfaces to confuse their aim. He had even prepared for the possibility that they might try to surrender, though he had no intention of accepting. Crenshaw was the last to die, and James made sure he understood exactly why he was dying. As the overseer lay bleeding from a dozen wounds, James knelt beside him and spoke in the same calm, conversational tone he had used with Hayes. "Do you remember Mary?" James asked. "The girl you beat for collapsing in the heat. She died 3 days after I escaped. The wounds you gave her became infected, and she died in agony. Do you remember old Sarah, my grandmother? You sold her medicine to buy whiskey, and she died coughing up blood because she couldn't afford the treatment she needed." James continued reciting a litany of cruelties, each one a nail in Crenshaw's psychological coffin. By the time the overseer finally died, he understood that his death was not random violence, but justice, brutal and personal. But James wasn't finished. He took Crenshaw's whip, the same whip that had scarred his back, and used it to hang the overseer's body from a tree where the other hunters would find it. Carved into the tree trunk was a message that would be talked about in whispers for decades. The wages of cruelty are paid in full. Word of Crenshaw's death spread through the county like wildfire. The man who had terrorized enslaved people for 20 years was dead, killed by one of his own victims in a display of tactical brilliance that military officers would study for years to come. But the psychological impact was even greater than the tactical achievement. For the first time in the history of Virginia slavery, the enslaved population had a hero, someone who had not only escaped, but had turned the tables on his oppressors in the most dramatic way possible. On plantations throughout the region, enslaved people began to whisper James's name with something approaching reverence. He had done what they had all dreamed of doing but never dared attempt. He had made the masters afraid. And in the mountains, the hunt continued, but now the hunters were the ones being hunted. As winter approached, the hunt for James had become something far beyond a simple manhunt. It had evolved into a symbol of the fundamental conflict at the heart of American society, the struggle between those who would enslave and those who would be free. Jonathan Davenport, driven by a mixture of rage, pride, and genuine fear, had increased the bounty to $2,000 and brought in professional slave catchers from as far away as New Orleans and Charleston. These weren't farmers looking for easy money or local toughs trying to impress their neighbors. These were men who made their living hunting human beings, men who understood that their prey was dangerous and acted accordingly. The new hunting party was led by a notorious slave catcher named Jeremiah Stone, a man whose reputation for brutality was legendary even in a brutal profession. Stone had been hunting runaways for 25 years and had never failed to bring back his quarry, dead or alive. He was methodical, patient, and utterly ruthless. "This isn't about the money anymore," Stone told his assembled team of 12 professional hunters. "This is about proving that no slave, no matter how clever, can defeat the natural order. If we let this boy get away with what he's done, every plantation from here to Georgia will be dealing with copycat killers within a year." Stone was right to be concerned. Word of James's exploits had spread far beyond Virginia. On plantations throughout the South, enslaved people were whispering his name and dreaming of following his example. Several attempted escapes had already been attributed to James's influence, and plantation owners were becoming increasingly paranoid about the possibility of organized resistance. The psychological impact of James's campaign was indeed spreading like wildfire through the enslaved communities of the South. Songs began to appear in the slave quarters, coded spirituals that told his story in metaphor and symbol. Children played games that reenacted his victories over the hunters, most dangerously for the plantation system. Enslaved people began to organize their own escape attempts using tactics they had learned from the stories of James's exploits. But Stone had made one crucial error in his assessment of the situation. He still thought of James as a slave, clever and dangerous perhaps, but fundamentally limited by his background and education. Stone couldn't conceive that a man born into bondage could have evolved into something that transcended the categories of master and slave entirely. James had indeed transcended those categories. Over the months of his freedom, he had become something new. Not just a runaway or even a rebel, but a force of nature, a living embodiment of the rage and determination of an entire people. He had studied his enemies so thoroughly that he understood them better than they understood themselves. He had learned to think not just tactically, but strategically, not just about survival, but about victory. During the weeks before Stone's arrival, James had been busy preparing for what he knew would be the final confrontation. He had established multiple base camps throughout the mountains, each one stocked with weapons, supplies, and intelligence gathered from his previous encounters. He had mapped every trail, every stream, every cave and crevice that could provide advantage or escape. More importantly, James had begun to think beyond his own survival. He had started leaving caches of supplies and weapons in locations where other runaways might find them. He had carved detailed maps and instructions into hidden cave walls, creating a legacy that would help future fugitives even if he didn't survive the coming battle. The final confrontation was inevitable, but James chose the time and place with the same careful calculation he had applied to everything else. The location was a box canyon deep in the mountains, a place that appeared to be a perfect trap for a desperate fugitive. The canyon had only one entrance, steep walls on 3 sides, and no apparent escape route. To Stone and his men, it looked like the ideal place to corner their prey. They were wrong. James had spent weeks preparing the canyon, turning it from a natural prison into an elaborate killing ground. He had studied the terrain with the eye of a military engineer, identifying every advantage and eliminating every disadvantage. He had cached weapons and supplies in hidden locations throughout the area. Most importantly, he had prepared multiple escape routes that were invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. The canyon itself was a masterpiece of defensive engineering. James had identified weak points in the rock walls and had spent days carefully placing explosive charges that could bring down strategic sections on command. He had dug concealed firing positions that provided perfect fields of fire while remaining invisible from below. He had even diverted a small stream to create a water source that would allow him to survive a prolonged siege. But perhaps most ingeniously, James had prepared the canyon to be a psychological weapon as well as a physical one. He had arranged the bones of animals in patterns that would be visible to anyone entering the canyon, creating an atmosphere of death and foreboding. He had carved messages into the rock walls that would be illuminated by the morning sun, messages that spoke directly to the fears and guilt of his pursuers. James had also prepared a series of false escape routes designed to confuse and misdirect his enemies. These apparent exits were actually elaborate traps that would channel pursuing forces into predetermined killing zones. He had studied the psychology of military tactics and understood that professional hunters like Stone would expect him to have an escape plan, so he gave them several, all of them deadly. The trap was baited with James's most audacious gambit yet. He allowed Stone's men to capture another runaway, a young man named David, who had escaped from a plantation 50 miles to the south. But instead of simply rescuing David, James used him as bait, allowing Stone to think he was closing in on his primary target. The psychological warfare began immediately. James started appearing at the edges of the hunting party's vision, always just out of rifle range, always seeming to lead them toward the canyon. He left obvious trails and clear signs of his passage, making Stone believe that desperation was finally driving his quarry into making mistakes. "He's getting careless," Stone told his men, as they followed the increasingly obvious trail. 3 months of running have finally broken his nerve. He's making the kind of mistakes that will get him killed. Stone was half right. James was indeed making mistakes, but they were calculated mistakes, designed to draw the hunters into a position where their superior numbers and firepower would become disadvantages rather than advantages. The hunting party entered the canyon on a cold February morning when the mountains were locked in winter's grip and the forest had become a crystalline maze of ice and snow. They found what appeared to be James's camp, a small fire, scattered supplies, signs of hasty abandonment. They spread out to search, confident that their quarry was finally trapped. Stone positioned his men with military precision, covering every possible escape route, establishing overlapping fields of fire, preparing for a siege if necessary. He had learned from the mistakes of the previous hunters and was taking no chances. But James had learned too, and his education had been far more thorough. The first explosion brought down a section of the canyon wall, but not randomly. James had calculated the blast to block the main entrance, while leaving his own escape routes intact. The falling rocks crushed 2 of Stone's men instantly and trapped the rest in the canyon with their prey. The second explosion triggered a carefully planned avalanche that buried 3 more hunters and filled the air with blinding snow and debris. In the chaos that followed, James moved through the remaining hunters like an avenging spirit, using weapons he had taken from previous victims, turning their own tactics against them. But this wasn't just a battle, it was a reckoning. As James fought his way through Stone's men, he spoke to each one, telling them exactly why they were dying. "You're Benjamin Crawford from Alabama," he said to one hunter as he drove a knife between the man's ribs. "You've been hunting my people for 8 years. You killed a pregnant woman in Mississippi because she tried to protect her unborn child." "You're Samuel Morrison from South Carolina," he told another as he crushed the man's skull with a stolen rifle butt. "You specialize in tracking children. You've separated more families than yellow fever." Each death was personal, each killing was justice delivered with surgical precision. James had researched these men as thoroughly as a prosecutor preparing for trial, and he was delivering verdicts that no court would ever pronounce. When the snow settled and the echoes faded, only Jeremiah Stone remained alive, and that was only because James wanted him to live, to carry the story back to those who would listen. Stone lay pinned beneath a fallen tree, his legs crushed, his rifle out of reach, staring up at the man who had destroyed his entire team. James stood over him like a figure from a nightmare, covered in blood and snow, holding weapons taken from the dead hunters. "Tell them," James said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of oppression. "Tell them that the slave they hunted no longer exists. Tell them that something else has taken his place, something that remembers every whip, every chain, every moment of stolen dignity. Tell them that the mountains have eyes now, and they're watching." James knelt beside Stone, his face inches from the broken slave catchers. "Tell them that James is dead. The property they owned, the boy they whipped, the man they hunted, he's gone. But what's taken his place is something they created with their own cruelty. Tell them that every plantation, every auction block, every slave ship has been building toward this moment. Tell them that the reckoning has begun." Stone tried to speak, to threaten or bargain or plead, but James silenced him with a gesture. "You don't get to talk anymore," James said quietly. "For 25 years, you've been the one with the power, the one with the weapons, the one who decided who lived and who died. Now it's my turn." James stood and began walking away, leaving Stone alive but broken, trapped beneath the tree with no hope of rescue. As he reached the edge of the canyon, James turned back one final time. "When they find you, if they find you, tell them this. The age of easy hunting is over. Tell them that somewhere in these mountains there's a man who knows their names, their faces, their crimes. Tell them that the hunted has become the hunter, and the hunt will never end." Stone survived for 3 days before exposure, and his injuries finally killed him. When a rescue party found his body weeks later, they also found a message carved into the tree that had pinned him. The last lesson: there is no escape from justice, only a delay in its delivery. James was never seen again, though for decades afterward, slave catchers would refuse to enter certain parts of the Blue Ridge Mountains. They spoke in whispers of a ghost in the woods, a spirit of vengeance that protected runaways and punished those who would drag them back to bondage. Some said he died in those mountains, finally free but alone. Others claimed he made it north, that he lived out his days in Canada or the Free States, his legend growing with each telling. Still others believed that he remained in the mountains, a guardian angel for other runaways, a nightmare for those who would pursue them. But perhaps the truth is simpler and more powerful than any of those versions. Perhaps James became exactly what he needed to become, not just a man who escaped slavery, but a symbol of what happens when the oppressed refuse to remain victims, when intelligence and determination transform desperation into deadly purpose. His story spread throughout the enslaved communities of the South, told in whispers around cabin fires, passed down through generations as both inspiration and warning. It reminded people that freedom had always come at a price, and that sometimes the only way to break chains was to forge them into weapons. In the years that followed, the number of successful slave escapes in Virginia increased dramatically. Plantation owners found themselves dealing with runaways who seemed to have learned new tactics, new strategies, new ways of thinking about the relationship between hunter and hunted. Some attributed this to James's direct influence, believing that he was still alive and training other fugitives. Others thought it was simply the power of his example, showing enslaved people that their oppressors were not invincible. The truth was probably both. James had proven that intelligence, preparation, and absolute determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds. He had shown that the relationship between master and slave was not natural or inevitable, but artificial and fragile. Most importantly, he had demonstrated that those who profited from human misery were not immune to the consequences of their actions. The mountains still stand, and somewhere in their shadows, the legend of James continues to whisper its message: that no chain is strong enough to hold a mind determined to be free, and no hunter is safe when the hunted decides to hunt back. His story reminds us that throughout history, the human spirit has found ways to resist even the most brutal oppression, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is the refusal to accept it as inevitable. In a world where human beings were treated as property, James chose to become something that property could never be: truly, terrifyingly free. And in doing so, he lit a flame that would burn in the hearts of the oppressed for generations to come, a flame that no amount of violence or intimidation could ever extinguish. The legacy of James lives on not just in the mountains where he made his stand, but in every person who refuses to accept injustice, who chooses resistance over submission, who understands that freedom is not a gift to be given, but a right to be claimed. His story is a reminder that even in the darkest times, even when the odds seem impossible, the human spirit can find a way to fight back. And sometimes, just sometimes, it can win. What did you think of James's incredible story of survival and vengeance? This tale reminds us that throughout history, the human spirit has found ways to resist even the most brutal oppression. The story of James shows us that intelligence, determination, and the refusal to accept injustice can overcome seemingly impossible odds. Subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories that will leave you speechless, and let me know in the comments, do you think James was a hero fighting for justice? Or did his methods go too far? The answer might reveal more about our own values than we expect. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more amazing historical stories that challenge the way we think about justice, freedom, and the price of resistance. This is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real persons, events, or places is purely coincidental and should not be interpreted as a factual representation. While this story draws inspiration from the historical realities of slavery and resistance in 19th century America, the characters, specific events, and narrative details are entirely fictional and created for dramatic purposes. The story is intended to honor the memory of those who suffered under slavery and those who fought for freedom, but it should not be considered a historical account of actual events.